This was not something that was fly by night or designed and executed, on an instant notice. This was, I mean, if it is a deep state inside job, and I'm very much convinced that this is a deep state inside job, then this was on the design board with a few people who were tasked with it.
This has been a tumultuous week in American politics. We've seen President Trump nearly killed by an assassin's bullet, and the abortion at nearly full term of Joseph Biden, the usurper, from the Democrat Party's nomination process. But today our focus with Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at Western University, will be on the assassination attempt of July 13th. My hypothesis fit the gross facts as conveyed by the videos and the pundits and even the officials in the FBI. That hypothesis was that a lone shooter fired at President Trump from the roof of an adjacent building a mere 450 feet away. Part of that hypothesis, however, was that the deep state was responsible for two things: sowing the seeds of hate against President Trump, which provided a motive for any would-be assassin, and a planned incompetence, providing the opportunity for some gunman to do the deed. Now, as more data became available, I revised my hypothesis accordingly, and video analysis of where the bystanders were when hit, and audio analysis provided by Dr. Chris Martinson and Health Ranger on X had provided compelling, perhaps irrefutable evidence that there were at least two shooters who were shooting at President Trump. One was the gunman on the roof. The other, most likely, was stationed inside that same building, building number 6, shooting through an open window. Confusing the issue is the identity of the rooftop shooter. Was it 20-year-old Thomas Crooks or 37-year-old convicted Antifa felon Maxwell Yerick? But I'll leave that issue for another time. Suffice it to say that I'm convinced that either directly or indirectly, the deep state tried to assassinate President Trump just as they successfully assassinated President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Now, with that in mind, Salim, with that background, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the events of July 13th, starting perhaps with, do you agree that the deep state tried to assassinate President Trump?
The moment I heard about this assassination attempt on the late afternoon of July 13, and immediately, my thoughts immediately seeing the first scenes of the events unfolding, immediately went to Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. It was almost like a, reflex. It was intuitive that, my God, this is another Dallas type attempt. In other words, this is an inside job. And then now where we are a week later, and with all what we have investigated and looked at and read about it, and our understanding of it, I'm now even more convinced since July 13 evening and all that has played out, that this was an inside job. This is going to be written about, this is going to be a massive discussion going on. 61 years later, after JFK, the discussion hasn't stopped, but everything almost, it seemed, choreographed, and the fingerprints on what happened this was an inside job, a setup, and we hopefully will go into the setup and into which President Trump was basically walked into and put on the stage as a target for the assassins, one or two shooters or more than two shooters, and I'll come to that too as you have your thoughts on the matter. Just as on November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy was put on an open limousine without adequate security service people around him. And those who were around him got off the car, the bike board, and he was left completely alone to the assassins. You know,
On that point, Salim, if you recall, and I'm sure you do because I think I recently looked at the video and shared it to you, when he was leaving the airport in the open limousine, and the word came from the car behind, the Secret Service man in charge told the Secret Service who were running alongside the vehicle to come back. They're going, what do you mean? They were shrugging their shoulders. What do you mean come back? He shrugged his shoulders 3 times. What? This doesn't make sense. So to that point is that even though it may have been a deep state inside job, not everybody, you know, takes the blame. Those Secret Service who were running along with President Kennedy were perplexed. They weren't part of the inside job. They were just doing their job. When they were told to withdraw, they withdrew. Wouldn't you think that that may be the case today with Trump?
yeah, I mean, when I'm saying inside job and you're saying inside job, it doesn't mean, and the literature on President Kennedy is vast and has been thoroughly discussed. And now, except for those people who still have their head in the sand, and who are in some way still stuck up with the narrative of the deep state. Uh, as Tucker pointed out just before he was fired from Fox News, that was one of the big stories that he put out a year and a half or 2 years ago, that the CIA killed Kennedy. And Robert Kennedy Jr. immediately responded. If my memory is correct, but the exact words I'm trying to figure out. But he responded immediately that this was the bravest, most courageous discussion on the mainstream media. That is, Tucker did that last year, 23, before he was fired. And that was exactly the 60th anniversary timing of 60 years. And the narrative has been a lone gunman and a magic bullet, which is the official version, and nobody believes that. And the question is, why hasn't those files been released 60 years later? It should have been released much earlier, but 60 years later, when nobody is around. So by the time people get the same degree of conviction in America. America is a completely divided society. It's a red and blue society, or you might say going back to Lincoln's time, it is a society divided between the North and the South, the Mason-Dixon line, the free states and the slave states. So America is completely divided today, maybe even worse divided than what it was, because in the 1860s, the 1850s, America was a much cohesive state in the sense of the people, the demography. It was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country with a minority Catholics and so on. Now it is a completely multi-ethnic state. Southern open waters and all of that. So it's a whole different fabric of the country that we are now talking about. But the fact remains it is deeply divided. And so by the time there is some conviction about the deep state attempt to take out President Trump, and I mean, these are my opening remarks. Why and how? I mean, that was what happened in 1963. So when we're talking about, or when I'm raising the issue about, and I think you are in some degree in concurrence with it, and as a conversation proceed, we will know, where are our agreements and if there are disagreements, in terms of perspective. We are talking history after all. And July 13th assassination attempt on President Trump is now history. It's gone into the history book. It is not going to be only in the hands of the establishment people, the deep staters. It is now in the hands of the vast majority of Americans equipped with iPhones and audios and everything. It was not what was in 63 when none of these, the technology was not there and the people was not informed. They only got the information through the mainstream radio and television. there is a whole lot of convergence: domestic politics, international politics. Of course, the deep state, and so the plotting and the inside job doesn't mean that the entire structure of the American government is involved in it, or the people around the president who are moving around with him are involved in it. It is strategically placed persons who are in the confidence of the deep state, who have been tasked, chosen and tasked with the plot. That means they are the inside people. It is like, I mean, to take from a Shakespearean play, the most well-known famous scene of Caesar walking into the Capitol, and then the assassin, who are senators in the Capitol inside the Capitol, they move. That doesn't mean all the other. I mean, how many senators were there? Maybe there have been 300 senators, people in the Capitol where Caesar stepped in to speak were involved in it. But the hand-picked people, they knew, and they knew the signal, and they knew when to move, and they moved accordingly. So that's the deep state action. This was not something that was fly by night or designed and executed, on an instant notice. This was, I mean, if it is a deep state inside job, and I'm very much convinced that this is a deep state inside job, then this was on the design board with a few people who were tasked with it.
So
And
who are the deep state, Salim?
well, I mean, people will have different definitions or different, features and attributes that they're going to talk about it, or who will be totally dismissive of the idea of deep state. The Democrat Party will be totally dismissive of the idea of deep state. If you ask the Uniparty members in the Congress, the Uniparty, I mean, Uniparty is this: the Democrats and the Republicans are the two faces of the same coin. Whoever we vote for, we are voting for the deep state, the policies of the deep state, the people behind the scene who are the power holders and who run the matter, and people like Biden. I mean, Biden is now a complete perfect example of the deep state. Biden was a man, or had become a man in the process, beginning in 2008 to where we are in 2024, a man with marshmallow for brains, or what T.S. Eliot called, a head filled with straw. So these are placeholders, whether they are good at it, like Obama was very good at it, or Bill Clinton, George Bush, good at it in the sense that George Bush's the basic man who ran the show was Dick Cheney on the main issues, war issues, what happened on the 9/11 and so on. That these people are the representative of the deep state, and the president and others around them are placeholders. Same thing goes into the Congress. But now coming back to in my construction of answer to your question, I will fall back to the warning on the last day that President Eisenhower was in the White House, the Oval Office, and he spoke out in his farewell address. And in fact, that entire farewell address was addressed to warning the people about the deep state. He constructed it in terms of military-industrial complex. So the cabal that finances and runs and manages the military-industrial complex. In his original terminology, it was military-industrial Congressional complex. We might now add to that, which is something that Ray McGovern has done, former CIA analyst, intelligence analyst during the Reagan administration and before the Reagan administration, that it is the military-industrial congressional big pharma, media, and the think tanks together that becomes the deep state. But going deeper into this matter and more precise, the very first string of the deep state, and the most important string of the deep state, are the law enforcement, and the three-letter agencies.
The TLA, yeah.
The three-letter agency that constitutes the arm of the deep state.
Is it true? And I heard this just recently. I'm not an expert on American constitutional matters, but I understand that the three-letter agencies, for example, the FBI, the NSA, the CIA,
The
those
DNI.
kinds of agencies are unconstitutional in that the Constitution does not give the president the authority to create these agencies, and yet they were all created by presidential edict. And so therefore they can be, with the stroke of a pen, dissolved by presidential edict. Would that be correct?
My understanding is you're correct in the sense that all of these, especially the three-letter agencies, the intelligence agencies that have come about, and there's 17 of them. It's not one or two. It is like uh, what Ronald Reagan talked about it. What is the permanent feature of the government is what the government creates. There's no sunset law, and they just grow and grow and grow. So yes, I mean, the making of, for instance, the most important and the most vulgar, therefore the most controversial, is the CIA. The CIA came out of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, during the Second World War, uh, when Roosevelt was a president, and the OSS was there to do the intelligence work. And then Roosevelt died, and Truman succeeded him as a vice president. And then when he, on his own term, became the president after the 1948 election, by an executive order, he created the CIA out of OSS. So it was an executive order. And that's been the basis of the creation of all of this, going back to the very first one that was created by President Woodrow Wilson during World War I, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And it was an executive order, and it was used to crush the opposition to the war that President Woodrow Wilson took the Americans into when his Congress, the Democratic Congress and the Democratic President, passed the Espionage Act of 1917. So anybody questioning, anybody challenging, anybody disputing that act or behaving in any way that would be suspicious under that act would be held, taken to prison.
So the only agency of that ilk would be the Office of Naval Intelligence. I understand that is constitutional.
Yeah. So absolutely right. The Office of National Intelligence is not only the oldest, but it was brought about, if my memory serves me correctly, under George Washington with the full congressional approval, that it is a statutory based, arm of the government, of the executive. And so anything that has to be funded by the taxpayer, let's put it on the bottom line, the axiom. Anything that is going to be funded by the taxpayer has to be then brought into being with the statute passed by the Congress. It's the taxpayers' money, right? You just don't create things out of thin air. But if you're going to create something, that the president being the chief executive in constitutionally, there's a separation of branches, right? So there is clear division of powers, and one cannot get into one division, cannot get into the lane of the other division. It's constitutionally separated. So the executive is the president, the commander in chief of the United States of America. And he has the authority to appoint and delegate his power to others within the executive branch. So plenipotentiary powers, that is embassies, the ambassadors. That's the job of the State Department. It comes from the authority of the executive branch. It comes from the authority of the president, and there it is. And I mean, one can open up the Constitution and look at the executive powers. It is all listed and enumerated. Anything that the president does that is not enumerated, that has to be then processed through the Congress.
So to capsulize it, then the deep state are not only these three-letter agencies who have run amok with the power that they have been given, but also leaders in the media, leaders in Congress, and multi-billionaires who hold, who own the means of production, so to speak, the military-industrial complex. So it's a cabal of like-minded people who are corrupt and who do not hold the best interests of the United States at heart. They're unelected, and they are responsible for so much death and destruction in the world.
Yeah, I will go along with it, with the proviso, with the qualification that when all of this begins, everything has a point of origin. So when a president starts off something, it might be with the best of intention. It is for the state. There is a national security, and then there's a political side of it where you debate it, and that is protected by the First Amendment. Right? That's the crown jewel of the American Constitution. So take the case of the three-letter agencies. The OSS was created by President Roosevelt, but it was a wartime operation. But now it's going to become permanent with the executive order of Truman that turned the OSS into CIA, right? And so it's done on an executive order. So when it was done, post 1948, there was national security memos that were driven. And the most famous one, I think, if I remember correctly, the National Security Memorandum NSC or NSA 61, under the basis of which all of this came together, the whole Cold War structure that was put together, and that happened under President Truman's term. And it was done on the basis of an EO. It was not done on the basis of a congressional statute, or he did not take the matter into the congressional statute and took on a life of his own. So the first generation of people around President Truman, who had come out of World War II, who had guided President Roosevelt, after all, the chief of state, except for very rare occasion, have been non-military men. FDR, four-time elected president, was not coming from the military or the Navy. He had not served. He was a civilian. He was a businessman, a plutocrat. Whereas Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces, five-star general in the Second World War. So and George Washington is the ultimate example. The man was not a politician, He was an executive. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And then he was elected the president, So it was under his authority that the ONI was created, the Office of Naval Intelligence, back and under statutory provisions of the Congress. So that's the only organization in that sense, which you pointed out, which has the lawful legitimacy, and it is the oldest. Everything else subsequently emerges after Second World War. And it's very important to here point out that America before 1941, going into the war, and America after 1945, coming out of the war, is not anymore the same America. What has happened, very important, which is what was in 1961, Eisenhower's entire farewell address was based upon, if people go back and analyze it, is that America had turned into what Eisenhower described as a military-industrial complex. America did not have the sort of military industry churning out destroyers and aircraft carriers and Liberty ship as it was doing during the war, which beat the German and the Japanese, or producing the tanks and the planes and the whole panoply of what becomes the modern military state, which America became. America wasn't that before 1941, you know. And so now, and going into then post 1945, there comes the whole issue. You have all of this thing. Now you have to have a reason for expenditure for all of these things. Massive expenditure that is going. The expenditure was a wartime expenditure. Now, so you have to either bring it down, dismantle it, and become a peacetime economy and go back to being part of what America was, in a constitutional republic, or you're going to have, if you're going to maintain the structure, then you have to have what? You have to have a permanent enemy. That was the Cold War.
Now we're getting into the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the reasons why he was murdered by the deep state.
That's right. I mean, the situation in 1963, when the assassination of President Kennedy took place, and the situation in 2024 July, when the assassination attempt on President Trump took place, you have to keep in mind that it is a completely different America in many ways, and it is a completely different political climate, political events that is taking place. What is the commonality that struck me, which is what I'm putting on the table, and that's the conversation we're having, to your opening remarks, is the commonality, and the commonality of 63 in Dallas and 24 in Butler, Philadelphia, is the inside job of taking out a sitting president, a commander in chief. In the case of Kennedy, he was the sitting president, commander in chief. In the case of Trump, he was a former president, in the sense he was president number 45, commander in chief, who in 2024 July was the putative nominee for the GOP going into the 2024 election, right? And if he wins, he will be the 47th president, 45, 47 president, and the commander in chief. So there is that commonality that it is. But exploring the vectors that comes together in terms of deep state, taking out President Kennedy, and the vectors that comes together in the deep state seeking to take out President or former President Trump, are different in the sense of what was at play, right? In the case of President Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963 was not only an inside job, it was a coup d'etat in which a sitting president was taken out, and in his place, his vice president was installed and inaugurated, and that leads to a whole different issue. I mean, if you have the time, who was LBJ and so on and so forth. But the vectors were there: foreign policy, domestic policy, the priority, and the warning of Eisenhower was the immediate predecessor, right? The immediate predecessor of Kennedy. And you have that warning hanging like a cloud over your head that is any analysis going into that 63, and all the pointers are there. He was taken out. John F. K. was taken out. John F. K. became the marked man after Bay of Pigs. That's what the number one domestic issue that came to play. The very first thing that President Kennedy, now coming in after his inauguration, is presented with by the CIA, the man in charge of the CIA, the director, Alan Dulles, the whole Bay of Pigs operation. President Kennedy is very reluctant to sign off on that, but it had been processed and prepared under Eisenhower. And so there was that aspect of differential to President Eisenhower. And trusting in some ways. I mean, here's a new man coming in who doesn't have full details of everything that has been charted out. So trusting what was being presented, that this would, yes, give the green light, that is the precedent authority needed to move, and things will proceed accordingly. The intelligence had been there, and the preparation had been there, and so on. But the one thing that was not there, and that President Kennedy was loath to provide and did not provide, was in the operation, Bay of Pig operation, was the role of the army. The most important vector in the 20th November 22nd, 63 assassination of President Kennedy was the CIA Bay of Pigs Cuban vector. So the Cuban mafia would get involved in the shooting of President Kennedy. So that's what I was setting out. The Bay of Pigs failed, and President Kennedy became the target. He became the target in the sense that the failure of Bay of Pigs for the Cuban community was that President Kennedy had not gone full way through. And President Kennedy was on record after the failure of Bay of Pigs in 61, April, May of 61, about he went public in the sense within his own. He didn't broadcast it to the nation, but within his own circle, that he will get rid of the CIA. So that the whole, exactly what you issue that you raised about executive authority, or that is executive order, anything created by executive order has the life till the next executive order, whenever it comes, that revokes it, because it's not a statute.
Now jump ahead 61 years to President Trump, and we have a president who started no new wars, which, like John F. Kennedy, he does not want to play ball with the military-industrial complex. So, and he even used the words deep state during a press conference, I recall, which I think was probably the first time that it was acknowledged, at least from an official channel, that the deep state exists. So can you draw the parallels between JFK in 63 and DJT in 24?
Yeah, I mean, the parallel, exactly. I mean, the anti-war president. I mean, the difference between JFK and Donald Trump is that JFK was a warrior. He wore the uniform and of the Navy. He was a naval man, and he fought in Southern Pacific. He was injured, and so on and so forth. He commanded a PT boat in South Pacific. So he was a man. I mean, his predecessor was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, and then he comes into the White House, and he's a warrior. He's a man who has worn the uniform, right? But the interesting thing is that the warriors are the biggest peace lovers. It is the chicken hawks who are the biggest warrior, Lindsey Graham, right? So these are the people. I mean, again, it is a remarkable history that when we analyze this thing, we have to know also the biographical background of the people who are there, what made them who are there, you know? President Trump is not a man who came wearing a uniform. He's a businessman. And he's a man who has lived through this whole period of what Eisenhower won. But Eisenhower's warning was in 61. That is the development that took place from 45 to 61, and he's warning. And all of the warning that he made, ironically, converge on the head of President Kennedy. You know? But Trump, I mean, he's a boomer generation. Kennedy was born in 1916. President Trump was born in 1946, 30 years apart. Boomer generation. But his coming and going through the age in this period is the Vietnam War, is the Cold War. It's a war after war after war. From 1990, the end of the Cold War, and therefore what would be the peace dividend, dismantling the Cold War, making peace around the world. Most importantly, and particularly, the relationship with Russia, the former Soviet Union. Russia is out. Soviet Union has been dismantled, but Russia is still the nuclear giant. And the other side is China, you know, a rising both economic and military power and a nuclear power. And so President Trump is coming in, when he came in 2016, he doesn't want to continue those wars. He's a domestic man. It is make America great again, right? So what is the vector that comes into play with President Trump was the vector that was Eisenhower warning against, the military industrial complex. Because after the Bay of Pigs, the most important thing, the thing that has come to define now President Kennedy's administration, he was a president only for three years, 3 years and a few months. He was denied the full 4 years, and he was denied running for his second term, which he would have won most likely. Well, what was the issue? It was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world moved an edge towards a nuclear confrontation. You know, it was the most difficult issue that confronted President Kennedy in a climate of suspicion and all the other problems associated with the Cold War. And domestically, the deep state representatives in the Pentagon, in the three-letter agencies, wanting, if not the confrontation, the buildup of their own institution. And what did President, without getting again, because of limitation of time, without getting into the details, which we have talked about in the past and we can talk about again, President Kennedy worked out with Khrushchev the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Russian Soviet shift, they turned around from the line of the quarantine around Cuba, turned around, backdoor negotiation between Khrushchev and Kennedy was that Khrushchev will take out the missiles from Cuba, and 6 months later, Kennedy will take out the missiles from Turkey. And that was done, right? And what had come to the brink of a nuclear trade-off, mutual assured deterrence, and all of that was fizzled out. And then the president worked with Khrushchev to work out the first historic nuclear arms deal in the age of nuclear weapons. That is the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which would lead on to further. If the president had time, he did not know that he was on the crosshair of the deep state. If he had time, there would be further negotiation to dismantle, in some ways, the military-industrial complex, at the heart of which is the nuclear weapons. And so the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has the foreign policy side of the vector that comes together on the non-proliferation side, that leads to the issue of Israel with its Dimona project and bombs. So here is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has been saying since the breakout of the war in Ukraine, the special military operation, that if he had been the president, there would be no war. He would stopped it, and that he is open to talking with Putin and end this whole thing. And he said the mass killing that have taken place, now the numbers are atrocious. Over 500,000 Ukrainians killed, the country devastated, millions refugees, millions again crippled for their lives, and so on and so forth. And also the destruction on the Russian side, the people killed. But the most important thing, the danger of escalation to the point of possibly a nuclear war.
But as you and I have commented on before, this is the goal of the neoconservative agenda in the United States, is to have a war front with Russia and with Communist China. They want conflict with Russia, even if it's nuclear. I think that they can defeat Russia, they can use nukes, and that is how evil these people are.
So exactly that what you are just put on the table is the neocon vector. And we haven't discussed neocon, and I don't know whether we have the time here to discuss and open it up, because it's like opening an onion, and we possibly don't have the time. But if you want to come back with further,
just briefly, let's mention them. Yeah,
the neocons as such was not there with John F.K. The neocon phenomena is basically the 1980s and the full coming together, the 1990s, and the complete takeover by the neocons of the Bush administration, for instance, sorry, Biden administration. It was entirely neocon administration. But the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, we neocon. Who are the neocons? What are their objectives? Well, this neocon is the face, the political face, I would describe as, and that of the military-industrial complex, people who are in politics. As I mentioned, in 1945, as the war ended, but America had grown a military-industrial complex. It had become a military power. Now you dismantle that. The war is over. Now you want to build for peace. You want to negotiate. You come to peace. We don't know what would have happened if Franklin Roosevelt had not died, because it was his agenda. By studying Franklin Roosevelt, we know that he and Stalin had multiple discussion, open, face-to-face, and backdoor discussion between his people, FDR, and Stalin's people, that the post-war construction of Europe and the world would be one in which it will be Soviet Union, United States playing or working as two powers together, a condominium, and possibly there would not have been a Cold War. And there would have been a different sort of a global politics. And we don't know if that would have led to some sort of a diminution of the military buildup, and particularly of the nuclear buildup. You and I have talked about the use of the atomic bomb by Truman when the war was basically over, and all the military officers around Truman were basically of the opinion that nuclear weapon, atom bomb should not be used. It's just a matter of time and negotiation. But Truman used it. And that whole, we have discussed that use of the bomb was a signal of the breakup of the alliance between the Soviet Union and United States that FDR had cultivated and had put together during the war years. So the military-industrial complex needs a permanent enemy for the perpetual war, for the perpetual peace. That's the slogan. So this perpetual enemy is Russia, is China, is the Middle East, from 1990 to where we are now. The wars that have been waged against the Middle Eastern countries, Serbia, the destruction of Serbia, that was way. So this is, you need the enemy, and you push it. And neocons are the public face of it. They're neither liberal, they're neither Democrat, nor are they conservative. They're not Republican. They straddle both the side. They spin the political argument as intellectuals and diplomats and professors to justify the arming of America, the perpetual security issue of America, and so on and so forth, And a heavy influence in both on the intellectual side of it is the think tanks, the universities, the academia. There's a very heavy input on the neocon side of American Jews, and that leads to a whole different direction. So they are disproportionately represented in the ranks of the neocon. And in fact, one might say the intellectual godfathers of the neocon come from their ranks. We can name names, we can name the books, we can talk about them, who they are and where they come from, and what is their interest. And the interest is completely tied up with the military-industrial complex. So that's the vector. President Trump did not belong to that group. He was not a paid member of that group. He's not emotionally and philosophically and politically to the extent that he thinks philosophic. I don't think he does too much, but everyone has some philosophical consideration. So as a businessman, I mean, and now as a president, he has to have a worldview. That's what I would mean philosophical, a worldview. And his worldview is not one of making wars. That's why we see him standing in the 37th parallel, the ceasefire line, the military ceasefire line in Korea, shaking hands with Kim Jong-un, taking all the risks to go. Everybody else, until he became the president, was talking about the dangers of North Korea, the buildup of North Korea, the nuclear weapons of North Korea, the firing of the ballistic. And what does President Trump do? He goes to North Korea. He's ready to make a deal that, you trade off and we will help you make North Korea something like South Korea, even better than South Korea if you want, right? So he's a man whose worldview is, I don't have an enemy. That means American people don't have an enemy. That means what John Quincy Adams said, the sixth president of the United States said, son of John Adams, the second president of the United States said, that America doesn't go out looking for monsters. If America goes out looking for anything, it is to make a deal with it, so that we are both win-win. We have no perpetual enemy. That is the worldview of DJT, which is in a vastly different. I would say polar opposite of the neocon thinking. Neocon thinking, they have perpetual enemies.
If there was a symbol,
enemy, they will create enemies.
If there was a symbol to iconize the neocons and the military-industrial complex, it would be the mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion. Their agenda is death, and they intend to profit from it. I have to laugh sometimes when I see some of the people who are pro-Ukraine in this current conflict applaud that the United States is going to supply F-16s or Abrams tanks. And I'm going, you fools. These things will be destroyed, which is their intention. They send these things over there to get destroyed so that they may create more of them and fill their bank accounts in the process. Their intention is destruction. They have no love for Ukraine, no love for people in Israel or Gaza, no love for people in North Korea or South Korea. All they're interested in is control and money. That's my 2 cents worth regarding the military-industrial complex and the neoconservative movement in the United States.
Absolutely. So in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Pentagon chiefs and the Air Force chief was Curtis LeMay. Those people who have seen the movie Dr. Strangelove can recognize in Strangelove Curtis LeMay, who was a bomber command man during the Second World War in the Pacific region, and it was his squadron that flew the bombers that dropped the little boy and the big boy. I think that was the name of the two atomic weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he was pushing John F.K., as we now know, all of the records are all open, or have been open, pushing John F.K. to give the authorization to nuclear bomb Cuba. That's close it was, and that's exactly what you're talking about in the case of Ukraine. They want war. They're having their war. The question is the escalation. They're having the war, and the war is possibly going to come to an end with a thundering defeat, because this is not Iraq, this is not Libya, this is not Serbia, this is not Syria, this is Russia, and we can see where it is headed, into a disaster. And so they would like to escalate, and you are absolutely right. We are at the edge of it. So that's the vector. What was not there in John F. K's time, the neocon, it was simply the military-industrial complex, their representatives, which was primarily in the Pentagon and in the emerging three-letter agencies, because they knew that John F. K. would destroy, would basically revoke the CIA. It would just need an executive order. In fact, the last memorandum that he signed, national security memorandum, was to pull out the troops from Vietnam. And the man who succeeded him built up the troops to, the war escalated in Vietnam till you have 3 million dead Vietnamese or more, and 58,000 Americans dead.
I would add to our definition of the deep state, this rogues list, the Democratic Party of the United States. Now, it may not have been during Kennedy's time, because of course he was a Democrat. And there were a number of, I'll have to admit, a number of policies in the Democrat Party that were reasonable, and progressive at a time when they needed to be. But the Democrat Party today is 100% corrupt. 100%. They are part of the congressional part of the military-industrial congressional complex. Would you think so?
Yeah, I agree. But I would add to that there is the Republicans who have become uniparty, the
Oh, the
rhino.
rhinos. Yes.
Who is the most despicable human being in the Senate, in the Congress, in terms of what we're talking about, warmongers, is Lindsey Graham of North Carolina. Nikki Haley, who wanted to be the nominee, who ran against President Trump in this primary season, who President Trump appointed as his UN ambassador to get her out of the Beltway, and sent her to New York. She was the governor of South Carolina, signing on the artillery shell crushed the people in Gaza. They are an absolute psychopaths. I mean, what else would be the definition of General Curtis Lee May, who dropped the bombs, who pushed and agreed to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the war was basically over, and then was pushing President Kennedy to drop the bombs on Cuba. So we're dealing with an absolutely psychopaths with no virtue, no compunction, no scruples, no humanity to their action. That was not what Eisenhower was, even though there were very dastardly things done under his command, but in the wartime,
Isn't it telling that during this tumultuous time, as I started off with, we have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. coming out in a speech just the other day saying why he left the Democrat Party. They are no longer the Democrat Party of his father or his uncle or himself.
Exactly. And same thing was said by Tulsi Gabbard, who ran for the Democratic nomination in the 2020 election when Kamala Harris was running for it, now the vice president, and we haven't talked about the resignation that has taken place, and that she is running to be the nominee of the Democratic Party, who never got a single delegate, and now she is running to be the president, both in the 2020 election and a previous. So, yes, but I will again qualify it from a historical point of view. It is the Democrats who have brought about, taken America into wars. The only exception being that in the 100 plus year of history going through the 20th century, the only exception is Theodore Roosevelt, the Cuban. We've talked about that. You've discussed the main issue, 1898, that led to the Cuban War, Spanish War. That happened under Theodore Roosevelt, that was who was a Republican. But in the 20th century, it has been Democratic president. Woodrow Wilson taking America into World War I. Franklin Roosevelt taking America into World War II, even though it was, in his case, he made the argument that it was done because of Pearl Harbor, but that's a very murky history. And then all of that, Truman in the Korean War, Johnson with the Vietnam War, and so on. It's been Democrat president. Well, they talk on the one side that they represent, as you say, the progressive interest, progressive policy, and therefore the interests of the people. The interests of the people have led them to take the people to war so that the bankers can make money and the military industrial complex can profit, right? So the exception then becomes the Kennedys. That's again the irony. He was a Democrat. And yet, the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis changed the man, completely changed the man. He came with progressive values of the FDR, and he reached out to the FDR wing of the Democratic Party with Eleanor Roosevelt alive. Um, but the Cuban Missile Crisis opened his eyes to the dimension of what we are no longer in an age when peer powers can go to war when they are armed with nuclear weapons.
Do you think that it was a mistake for Trump not to release all of the hidden documents regarding the JFK assassination? Because I understand that they were supposed to be all released, yet he held some back under the reason that you wouldn't believe what I'm holding back. Is that a mistake?
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is he was on public record, right? So what you are saying is not something that is not in public record. Prior to winning the 2016 election, he had talked about it. He had talked about it during the primaries, and then after winning the 2016 election, he had, in the early days, was committed to opening the files, and then he was stopped. He was stopped. At least that's what he says. That Pompeo and others, that the CIA people, uh, put pressure upon him that he cannot do it. So in that context, we must keep in mind that Donald Trump, from the first day that he stepped into the Oval Office with his inauguration, was handcuffed by the deep state, and that we need to go through, because Donald Trump was a president 2017, 2021, but remember, he was under the threats of impeachment. There were two impeachments done on him. One even after losing the election that he lost or that was rigged against him, the 2020 election. He was under special counsel. He was under investigation on all the hoax charges of Russia, 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 with the FBI and the CIA, with the John Brennan and Comey, and then Comey's successor, Christopher Wray, and so on. And that vector we have to keep in mind. But in the case of JFK, those vectors were not there. It was basically the vector, the military industrial, the fallout from the Bay of Pigs, and therefore the Cuban exile community that provided part of the mafia gunmen and rogue elements to the CIA. The CIA is deeply involved with criminal world, because from that's where they recruit their people. So that was the Bay of Pigs. Then comes the Cuban Missile Crisis, and now it is the really heavy duty players who are against President Kennedy from the military industrial complex, and then you have the foreign policy side of it. I mean, both the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Middle East. So
On the other side, Salim, you're talking about the vectors that led to the assassination of Kennedy and attempt on Trump's life. On the other side, if we're making a comparison between 63 and 24, in 63, we had basically a couple of open microphones on police radio channels and the Zapruder film. And from that, decades later, even after the CIA tried to destroy or alter the Zapruder film, we have pieced together enough to convict the CIA and the Chicago mob and LBJ for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Today, we have everybody out with their cell phones filming everything with their microphones in high definition, and within a week, we have concluded pretty conclusively and convincingly that the deep state was involved. There was at least 2 shooters, that this was a planned event to assassinate President Trump within a week. This is fascinating. From this side of the assassination, you were talking about those vectors. On this side, we have amazing vectors to hold account the people like a Kimberly Cheetle, head of the SS, the security service. And I can only hope that this is not going to be repeated, but there's about 100 days left between now and the election in November. What is your idea? What is your thoughts about the likelihood that Trump will be killed between now and then?
God forbid. God forbid. I mean, the way you pose the question, but my fears are real. And we haven't gotten into talking about this. So if you have a few more minutes, we need to explore this. I mean, I've made the commonality analysis between 63 and 24. But there is also differences between 63 and 24, very major differences that in my mind, that needs to be put on the table in the discussion. In 64, the assassin got President Trump. Was it Lee Harvey Oswald, or was it the unknown shooter that we don't know? But
I think you mean 63 and Kennedy.
63. I mean, we're mixing up in my mind. There's so many things running around my head. But in 63, sadly, tragically, and that moment has not gone away from American history. In fact, that moment remains to be resolved, even though there are no one alive among the actors, right? They're all gone. It's 61 years later, we are talking about it. But if the country can ever be healed, it will have to be healed by opening the books on President Kennedy and fleshing out what happened on that Friday afternoon in Dallas, and who were the people. We have suggested who were the people, but they have to be, brought to the public with clear evidences and their fingerprints on what they did. So there was a dead body, and the primary witness who was taken into custody was was branded or was going to be indicted as the assassin, and then put on trial, or would have been put on trial, was Lee Harvey Oswald. And what happened? The man was shot in the police custody. So the principal witness from whom we would have heard, that is, the Americans would have heard, if he was on the witness stand in the courtroom, his side of the story, his last words, or almost his last words, dying, was, "I am a patsy." So the patsy was killed. He was a patsy. He was put there by the big state. And everything about him was created by the big state after his death to make him the lone gunman, right? And then that was made the official report of the Warren Commission that was put together by LBJ, President Johnson, to investigate into the events of Dallas, and they came up. Ultimately, the Warren Commission came up with the final report, And Lee Harvey Oswald is the assassin.
And it turns out that later on we learned that Dulles, for example, was complicit in the assassination of JFK, and he sat on the Warren Commission. He helped
Exactly.
write the report. The criminals are writing the reports.
He, so there it is. I mean, it is the wolves who have torn into the sheep pen, so to speak, and then the wolves are being put there to investigate who tore into the sheep pen. LBJ appointed Alan Dulles. Edgar Hoover, who was the FBI director, was LBJ's man.
And here we have today, as a matter of fact, while this is being recorded, this is Monday, Kimberly Cheadle is testifying before Congress right now as we speak. And I watched a bit of it before we started this conversation, and she is stonewalling them. She's not answering a single question. And that, I think, speaks volumes as to her complicit nature in this affair. Because you would think, first of all, that she should have resigned. She should have fell on her sword immediately, because she did say that this is the fault of the Secret Service. Well, who is the head of the Secret Service? She is. Well, why are you still sitting in that chair? Why are you still director? No integrity, no honor whatsoever.
Yeah.
And secondly, Salim, before you continue, we were talking about the killing of the witness. Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't the only witness who was killed. There were a number of suspicious deaths surrounding the people who were there that day, dying under mysterious circumstances. Like, a lot of car accidents happened. And I was thinking, when I was watching the videos of the Trump assassination attempt, of a lot of people who were very vocal about saying what they saw and when they saw it. And my mind immediately went to those people who were oddly, suddenly killed or died around JFK, and 9/11 too, by the way. A lot of people died who were ancillary to the event, but were witness to the event. So I'd keep an eye on some of these people.
Correct. But all of that is at play now, because as you a few minutes ago you pointed out, there is just about every single American has in his pocket, in her handbag, an iPhone with a camera. And some of these camera in some of these appliances are even more powerful than the cameras that were there in 1963 in the little hand that they're holding. So yeah, I mean, technology, the witnesses around today is all around the people, So the national surveillance state that failed to surveil Thomas Matthew Crooks in Butler, Philadelphia, has the situation where the entire American people is surveilling the national security state.
Wonderful.
The loop is working around, I mean, there are so many elements in this situation that we can talk this over several days, and I'm trying to compress it. So with President Kennedy's death, there was a dead body. They had to create a story about the death. That was the Warren Commission. And the story that was created was a lone gunman with a magic bullet, one bullet that hit several people, making, anti-physical. Law of physics was completely broken as the bullet went round to hit the governor sitting in front of President Kennedy, and somebody else was hit. But coming back to Lee Harvey Oswald, in the most secure place that a man can be, that is a witness can be, which is surrounded by police in a police station, was killed by Jack Ruby from the underworld. So that was the underworld that was run by Meyer Lansky, who was the critical person on the Jewish side of the equation, the Mossad agency. So the hands of the Israelis through the Mossad agency was involved in getting rid of the principal witness, silent. And then whose theory was the theory of the lone gunman and the magic bullet that became the official explanation, the official doctrine in the Warren Commission report? It was that of the district attorney from Philadelphia, Arlen Specter, who then goes on to become U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, Republican. Then he leaves the Republican and joins the Democrat in the last part of his life. Arlen Specter is a neocon. He comes from that segment of the American population from which segment came Jack Ruby, who was Jacob Rubinstein, who was hired or who worked for Meyer Lansky. These are fascinating details which makes up the tapestry of what happened on November 22nd, 1963. Moving on now to President Trump. Nothing has been completed about 63. I mean, we can go into much greater detail, but moving on, I mean, again, respecting time, if the bullet had gotten the man, that means President Trump at that nanosecond hadn't moved his head. The bullet was aimed at his skull, and his brain would have blown up in front of 300 million people who would be sitting and watching at that moment what happened. That bullet was going right there. And that nanosecond that he turned his head, that bullet scraped his ear, right? So the deep state failed. And the deep state is in a panic. What to do about this? Because the man survived. The hands of God saved him. There was no hand of God.
Not only did he survive, but he triumphed. This became a complete 180 degrees with his fist raised saying, fight, fight, fight. That iconic imagery will survive forever.
That's right. I mean, all of that was never in the calculation of anybody, right? What is in the calculation would be the brain blown out, and the man then, what we would be talking about would be the what ifs of history, just as we're talking about John F. Kennedy, And for the Democratic Party, the wing of the Uni Party, which is in power, the coup would have succeeded. In the case of 1963, the coup succeeded. An elected president, the chief executive, was taken out. In this case, the coup failed. But the coup actually succeeded. This was a continuation of the coup. The coup was actually in 2020, the election, right? So in that sense, President Trump was taken out. And after taking him out, they did not stop because they needed to destroy him. And that's what I'm coming to, compress the last 8 years from 2016 to 2024 into a nutshell. The man had won the 2016 election totally unexpectedly. Till the last hour of that night, he himself did not know that he was going to win it. And all the people talking about the results as they were coming in had, according to the New York Times, the needle on 90% that Hillary Clinton will win. But in the battleground state, the votes came late, but they came. They didn't stop counting. That's what they did in 2020. So they had learned from 2016. And the numbers slowly climbed up. And by past midnight, the numbers were Trump had won. If you remember, he came on stage after midnight. And Hillary Clinton was so drunk in her state of complete distraughtness that she couldn't speak. She couldn't concede. Whatever conceding that she did it the following day. So it was a total unexpected victory. This was not what is going to happen. They did not calculate. They did everything to prevent him. They called him, and they called the people around him and the people that were going to vote for him or were rallying around the rally. They were the deplorable, they were the basket cases, and all of that was going on. And now we know Trump was under surveillance. His Trump Tower was, plugged. They were hearing everything. They were following everything. And so here was the surveillance state, and the three-letter agencies had been weaponized by Obama's administration. The DOJ under Eric Holder with Obama, they had weaponized it. What was the Patriot Act to prevent another 9/11, even though that might have been an inside job? I'm now convinced that it was an inside job, but we won't get into that discussion. But the Patriot Act was to surveil the possible quote unquote terrorists, and the great war on terrorism was launched after 9/11. But with Obama, the Patriot Act was turned inside. That's what Edward Snowden told us. That's why he had to run away. That's what Julian Assange told us. The WikiLeaks told us. It was the American people who were being now the targeted. And among the American people, the one that was targeted most was Trump when he came out to run for the presidency, and the people around him. So they had him on the crosshair to undo his presidency, but they didn't expect him to win. The moment he won, they unleashed upon him all the fake cases. Who were the people who ran the fake cases against him? Were the three-letter agencies. It began with the Russia hoax, Operation Crossfire Hurricane. It was FBI people, directors of the counterintelligence, deputy directors of the counter. The most notorious man who came out, who became the face eventually, was Peter Strzok, who was having an affair with the counsel, Lisa Page, of the deputy director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe, whose wife was running for the state Senate seat in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, financed by the Democratic Party. This did not end. They took out Michael Flynn as a national security advisor immediately. In January, Michael Flynn, or February, January 20th is the inauguration day. By the second week of February, Michael Flynn had resigned and had to go. Why? Because he was going to be indicted for not having registered in the foreign FARA, what that stands for, Registration Act, foreign to be engaged in business with foreign companies. The acronym is FARA, F-A-R-A. And Michael Flynn was taken out on that basis.
You got to hand it to the deep state and these psychopaths, Salim, that they are tenacious. They use every single avenue that they can to defeat their enemy. They never become complacent. They never sit on their laurels. If they win an election, their eyes are fixed on the next election and destroying their enemy. And as bad as it may seem, I think that we, or at least Donald Trump, when he gets elected, unless it's not a fair election, he has to have the same ruthlessness as his opponents have had, as distasteful as that may be to people of principle and fairness. You have to use the tools at your disposal, just as your enemies are using in a war. And this is war. If they're firing at you, your Christian ethos may say, don't kill, don't murder, but you have to use the weapons at your disposal to destroy your enemy.
I hear you. I understand you. And the president, if Trump comes back as 47, will have to be as tenacious. My sort of reluctance to go full extent with what you have said, ruthlessness and so on and so forth, is precisely what is not required if the republic is to be restored. What are we fighting? I mean, all of this discussion that we're going on, that we have engaged in to this moment, beginning with the taking out of JFK in 63, the warning of Eisenhower. If it had been somebody else, like Jimmy Carter giving this warning, or Gerald Ford giving this warning, it wouldn't carry that much weight, in my opinion, as Eisenhower giving the warning. Because Eisenhower was the man of uniform, the supreme commander, who was then the supreme commander of, once the NATO was created, the first supreme commander of NATO. Right? And him giving the warning, I wish the people who are listening to us or who have listened to us and who are interested in these things can Google and find the speech of Eisenhower and read it. It is so important. So within the warning, so if one parse this warning and one analyzes what has happened, 61 is the speech that is given. President Eisenhower is reflecting on the period from 45 to 61. That's 16 years he's reflecting on, in which he has been at the center of American power. And what he's telling us is, in so many ways, that America, as a republican system, is being derailed, if it has not been already been completely derailed. I take that warning, I take those words, and then move forward to Kennedy. And we have discussed Kennedy with, and again, the limitation. Kennedy, that was a coup. The derailment was almost complete. And from Kennedy to 2024 attempt on President Trump, America is no longer a constitutional republic. That's the deep state. I pointed out, you asked me to define it. It said the three-letter agencies, the military-industrial complex, and then everything that feeds into that survives upon that. That is the parasite that lives on the body of the military-industrial complex, to work, to operate. Crony capitalists who are involved in it. Yeah. And the question that why Trump became the enemy. He didn't become the enemy on July the 13th. That was the last attempt on the part of the deep state to get rid of the enemy. So what is Trump's crime in the eyes of the deep state? That he becomes the enemy. It was only 2 weeks before that, June 27th, in the debate, the deep state was still confident that their lie was working, that the coup that had taken place in 2020 to remove Trump was safe and secure, because they will do it again. Whatever is needed to be done, save doing a JFK, they'll do it again to protect the coup, which is now the post-constitutional United States of America. And what happened on 27? The world saw, the Americans saw, and the world saw that for the 4 years, the face of the deep state was a man with marshmallow brain with straw in their head. That means this was a complete kabuki, including his vice president, who had 0 delegates in 2020 primary, raised to the position of vice president. That means the argument is that July 13 was, what happened was due to the incompetence of the people charged with protecting the president, that is, the Secret Service and all the various elements that the Secret Service draws upon, given its mandate from the local police, from the state troopers, and so on and so forth. But at the heart of it is the Secret Service. And the highest priority, in fact, the only priority of the Secret Service is to protect the president, the chief, the commander in chief. So that was the case in the case of Kennedy. But in the case of Donald Trump, he's the former president who is the putative nominee for the next election. So there's only one job. There's no second job. They have no other job. The job is to protect the ban. And so the spinning the argument that it was incompetent. Well, incompetence, I would say, is not a bug in the system. It is a feature of the system, so you can blame the system, that is the people who are doing the job, for incompetence. So it was incompetent. But the point is, he was the enemy to be taken out. So on June 27th, the debate showed that what we have, the whole kabuki theater, was now in front of the people. And the man standing on the other side, Donald Trump, basically in 2015 had challenged the deep state. And he had said he was going to drain the swamp, which was his way of saying he's going to deal with the deep state. And what the deep state did, they handcuffed him. They surrounded him. They made his administration paralyzed with lawfare, with false cases. And those did not end with his rigged removal, the coup of 2020 and the rigged election of 2020. They did not end. They pursued him as a quarry to silence him, that he will go away. They burdened him with cases after cases. In the American Constitution, Article 9 is the section that says there cannot be any post facto law. What we saw in the last 4 years is not only digging up issues that had been resolved, whether it is Stormy Daniel, whether it is his paying corporate taxes on his real estate, and all of those. You can't try a man a second time. Everything was thrown at him. 34 fake felonies. He is a felon. And yet the man is standing. Yet the man is walking. And so what does this man, the fake president, 46, Biden, say after the June 27 meeting? The debate is over. We have done all the talking we have to do. Now we have to put the bullseye on the man. It's on the record, right?
And a bullseye, exactly. Somebody followed his instructions.
Absolutely.
To the letter.
Absolutely. What happened on 13 was he was stripped of his security. Just as in
Dallas. They went to Jill Biden.
Huh?
They went to guard Jill Biden, who was having a fundraiser.
Yeah, so whatever they were doing, or their stories that the Secret Service, when they're not at work, they go to strip bars. So whatever, strip bars, drinking, Jill Biden, he was stripped of his security. I have the letter that Senator Josh Hawley has sent to Mayorkas, the Secretary of the Homeland Security, asking who were there on that date. We know that you guys had stripped down the thing. You had sent the President Trump's details somewhere else. That's the Jill Biden thing that you're talking about. And that you brought in people from HSI. HSI is Homeland Security Investigation, So they were not Secret Service people. And we saw the incompetence, to excuse this, to make up the story. Women around President Trump, the DEI. The woman is struggling with her holster and her gun, while President Trump is either down or he's being raised up, all all 5 feet, few inches tall, but this man is compared to them, a giant, 6 feet 4 inch tall, totally exposed, and so on and so forth. Well, they're not answering him. And as you mentioned, Keatle is stonewalling. So he was stripped off this. The point that I'm driving at, and this is again Joe Biden's word, he is an existential threat. He's an existential threat. That means the life and death issue. He has to be removed. But he's the existential threat to whom?
The military-industrial complex.
Exactly, the deep state, because it began with his election in 2016. The crime that goes unstated, because the system cannot investigate itself. So the crime that goes uninvestigated, and the media is the propaganda arm of the deep state, so they will not talk about it. That's left to the alternate media people like us talking about it, is that he exposed the deep state. All the precedents after Kennedy, now we can say almost without ambiguity, were all approved by the deep state. In the sense, they got compromised after they got nominated and they were going to get elected. I haven't mentioned the assassination attempt that failed on Ronald Reagan, March 1981. But there was the assassination of Robert Kennedy. He was not shot by the man who is still being held as an assassin, Sirhan B. Sirhan. He was shot from the behind, by a deep state agent. So this is what it is. The taking out of President Kennedy in 1963 was the constitutional republic on Israel, that the government, the elected members of the Congress, the executive, are the representative of the people, accountable to the people, answerable to the people. What Eisenhower warned, that the people you are electing are no longer representing you. They are the representative of the military-industrial complex and the donor class that feeds off and live off the military-industrial complex. The Boeings, the Lockheed, the Raytheon, what's the full name? It's escaping me now. So all of these who feed off. So all the 4-star generals, you cannot rise above a colonel without going through the Senate. But the Senate is the captive of the deep state. So any officer like Colonel McGregor cannot become a flag officer, a star officer, going up the ranks to ultimately becoming a 4-star general, because you have to go through the Senate. And if you're not politically on the same side, or you're not politically malleable, you retire. Because these guys who become 4-star generals, 3-star generals, they're no longer working to defend America. They focus on the job after retirement with the deep state.
Let me ask you to surmise, if you could. Trump is facing a sentencing coming up very shortly, where technically he could be sentenced to prison for 187 years or some ludicrous figure. If such a thing might occur, it would be incumbent, I think, on the Secret Service to say that we're not surrendering President Trump to this prison, because he would be Epsteined overnight. And then that, by the way, I think is another deep state assassination was Jeffrey Epstein, because sex is one of their tools for keeping people in line through blackmail. And Epstein was one of those operatives. So what do you think? Will Trump be sentenced to prison? And if so, will he be given up by the Secret Service?
Well, my thoughts are that Trump is now in that twilight zone, and my prayers are that he is well protected by his own people, the people that he trusts. But on the question of Epstein, we saw him being Epstein on July 13th. That's the thing. He was stripped. It
Well,
was
that's the way I was saying it failed. So now they must try again,
correct.
as tenacious as they are, as I said.
Right. So if he is sent to prison, the judge delayed the judgment for the convention. So we are anticipating now whether this particular judge is going to come back and make his. I mean, they found him guilty. It was all structured. The kabuki theater. So in that sense, he is a felon. Now there's the question of what the judge comes up with the punishment. My sense is, again, it's because it's a lower court judgment. Even if he's sent to prison, of course, the Secret Service is not going to give. Secret Service technically cannot give President Trump up to anybody. So the Secret Service goes with him. But the problem is the Secret Service is under Mayorkas, another neocon. The Biden administration is a neocon administration. Every single official in the three-letter agencies, which is part of the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland, he's another neocon. And again, from that special segment of the American population, the American Jews. And we haven't talked about what is this problem. In the case of John F. Kennedy, it was very clear, but in the case of President Trump, what is the problem? That he has these people on his back, as an existential threat, and why? Maybe we should come back and have another discussion on this matter. But the point here is that these are the people who run the Secret Service now. It's not Trump's people running the Secret Service. So when he was stripped of his Secret Service people for the June 13, we don't know. Even if the Secret Service goes with him into prison, we don't know who are these people going in with him. Officially, they're Secret Service. Trump doesn't know, and the people around him doesn't know. So the only safeguard for Trump is that Trump's lawyers, of course, will have their application in with the Supreme Court. And my thoughts are that the only safeguard for Trump is that immediately the Supreme Court steps in and puts an order to hold back on the punishment, whatever is pronounced by this lower court judge. And that stay order is something that the Supreme Court can immediately do. And then the case is put through the Supreme Court, the appeal process, But in the interim, that stay order will take away what the scenario that we're talking about, him being sent to the prison where he could be Epstein. And I think everybody is aware of that now. Everybody around Trump, everybody in the court system. So it is in the lower courts that you have the problem. And again, a little constitutional issue that we need to just put it on the table. The lower courts are where the judges are appointed by the political process of the governor in the thing. And so in the blue states, New York is where Trump was being tried for 34 felonies, and that's where it came down to the lawfare. The blue states judges are all Democrat judges. Blue state attorneys, district attorneys, they have won their elections with George Soros and others funding them, and so those decisions, those trials and where the decision has come down that Trump has been found guilty are from the lower courts. And those would be reversed because they are lawfare. They have no legal basis. We have seen already some of the reversals taking place. I mean, Jack Smith's case has been reversed. He's appealing it, but that is the Mar-a-Lago case on the Presidential Record Acts. Um, so the only security for President Trump or for anybody being victimized through lawfare at the lower courts is if their case gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides to listen to it because only the Supreme Court judges have gone through the process of nomination by the president and uh, consent by the Senate, the judiciary, and the full vote of the Senate. So even though there is politics there, but you don't have a Neil Gorsuch, a Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, the three most recent appointments. You don't have them there being appointed by Obama or Biden. You have them there nominated by, and appointed by the process under President Trump. And so I would imagine, I mean, to your question, I think that there will be immediate action taken, that you cannot do to a person, whether it's Trump or anybody else, who is a candidate and now the nominee for the election in November, that he cannot
I
be.
I hope so, that it will come to that. Salim, let's keep our ear to the ground. Boy, things are moving along so quickly.
Yeah,
It's hard to keep up, and there's so much swimming in our heads that it's hard to formulate opinions without more data, and data is still coming in.
right.
More videos will be released, more audio analysis, but I think only to put the fine point on the fact that this was a JFK Redux. This was another assassination attempt by the deep state. And we have to keep our ears to the ground and make sure that it doesn't happen in its fullness. That is, that Trump survives to become the
Absolutely.
next president.
Absolutely. And just to close it off, I mean, the evidence or the argument of ours or mine to your questions were of a historical nature and a constitutional nature, not in terms of the forensic analysis of
Sure.
the bullets fired on July July 13th, and so on. So the historical side is very important because that's the backstory and that fills out, why Trump becomes the existential threat and to whom? The deep state. Why did John F. Kennedy become the threat to the deep state? And he was taken out. And that's exactly what was the intent, um, or the motive behind the setup uh, that was being carried out on July 13. My final thought on this matter is also just again, as part of that historical discussion and the JFK issue, uh, 3 days before or 4 days before or after July 16, July 13 was the assassination attempt in Butler Field. 3 days after July 13, July 16 was the 25th anniversary of the death of John Jr., JFK's only surviving son, who died in 1999 in what is reputed to have been a plane crash, but there's also much controversy about that surrounding that. But the point is that his death, if he had survived, he was going to run for the Senate seat in New York that eventually was taken by Hillary Clinton because he was no longer alive. And his whole life mission, to the extent that it has been reconstructed by people who knew him and who spoke to the people around him, was that John Jr., as can be easily understood, was obsessed by the nature of his father's death, and he wanted to know why. And he would have opened the books on the Kennedy assassination. And the same thing was his uncle, Robert Kennedy, was the only man who knew all the details about his brother's killing, and he kept silent.
One of the best things I think Trump could do when he becomes POTUS 47 is to somehow engage Robert F. Kennedy Jr. into his cabinet. I think
Well,
that would be a remarkable thing.
well, according to what we now know, Trump is already in touch with Robert Kennedy Jr. The question will be whether Robert Kennedy Jr. wants to have a role in the Trump's administration. But Trump has the point I was heading at is that these data points that I'm put on the table, going back to JFK, Robert Kennedy was taken out because if he was going to be sworn in as the 37th president, LBJ was the 36th president, John F. K. was the 35th president. So if RFK was going to be sworn in, I mean, he had won the primary of the Democratic Party. The last primary was in California. He had won it, so he was the putative nominee of the Democratic Party for the 1968 election, just as Donald Trump, right? So everybody knew, LBJ knew, and the people around who took him out knew that Robert Kennedy as president would open the books. And he was his brother's attorney general, John F. K's attorney general. So he knew where the skeleton is, so to speak, and he would open it up. He was taken out. John Jr., whether that accident was a natural accident or was a deliberately, constructed accident. And that's the issue. That's the question that has never been answered. He would have done it. And where does Donald Trump come? Donald Trump was a lifelong friend of John Jr. He was a very New Yorker, both of them New Yorker, remember? And Jacqueline Kennedy, John Jr.'s mother, was a New Yorker. And John Jr. had started the magazine, George, devoted to, bringing high-powered, influential people on board to write for that magazine. But the main thrust of this magazine was to open the discussion on his father's assassination, right? And Donald Trump was involved in it. So what I'm coming back to, circling around the loop, is coming back to Donald Trump is, remember, before he ran, he ran for the nomination of the Republican Party in 2015, he was always known to be a Democrat.
That's true.
Right? Yeah. So there was a Democratic Party that was America First Party. There was a Democratic Party, there was American Party. That is what John Kennedy was, and that is what Donald Trump is. So it is quite true that there is a uniparty that is the deep state party. So whichever cap you wear, but if you are an America Firster, then you're not a part of the deep state. The uni party. And Trump is the outsider. And so when all of this thing was being done against Trump, right from the get-go, when Michael Flynn was taken off, Jeff Sessions, who was his attorney general, recused himself and left, right? And so on and so forth. And he was just about alone. All his appointment was funneled through the Senate, and they were the deep staters who were appointed, like Mike Pompeo as a CIA director, and then the Secretary of State. And he never got a recess appointment during the 4 years, which is critical. What it goes to show that while he was wearing the Republican cap to win the election, he was the outsider. And this was his crime. As an outsider, he wanted to bring back America back to the constitutional rail. And so my reluctance on that observation of yours, he has to be tenacious. He is tenacious. Otherwise, he would not be standing, after having been shot at, standing up, raising his fist, saying, fight, fight, fight. And as you say, is the iconic image that 100 years from now, people will be talking about it as, I don't know how to pronounce that term, but Iwo Jima, or Iwo Jima. I mean,
Iwo
again,
Jima, yes.
words I don't know. Tell me whatever is the correct pronunciation, but everybody knows what I'm referring to. The flag of the U.S. Marine. You know, in that battle, and Trump's fist is the symbolic, in that sense, iconic image that will outlast all of us, you, me, and everyone who's going to come after us. And that is exactly why he is in danger, because the deep state is at war with the American people.
Let's leave it there, Salim. I think that's a great point. That imagery of Donald Trump saying fight, 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 it gives me goosebumps whenever I see it. Thank you once
Thank,
again, Salim.
thank you.